alleged or an appearance assumed in order to cloak the real intention or state of affairs.
Initial access. OMI is trying to get into your network.
Listen, this is your manager, and I'm trying to send off an email. I got this document. Need you to confirm a few details. So go ahead and log in and tell me what you think. I need this now, so to make this convenient, here is the link. I'm a threat actor, phishing mark for email is urgent to distract you with it. So how fast you clicked it when you submitted the form with your password in it. You probably couldn't tell there was an actual difference in the URL. The domains look alike though, and to you will look fine though, but mine had typos and make it look like yours. See, I was in the mood today to make your account a communal space, but then you activated your trap card, and I saw you had 2FA, but I just shrugged, I'ma shake it off. Got on kid gloves, I'ma take them off. Got your phone number, I'ma make a call. I'ma break this wall, it just makes me lol. I'm moving quick, I'm on a mission. Yeah, I heard your network is lit. I'm trying to get in. Yeah, I'm trying to get me a hit. When I go fishing. Yeah, you probably think it's legit. I got you clicking. Yeah. Hello. Hi. I'm calling you from the IT department. We have been under attack by some hackers, and we think that your account might be a target.
Oh no, how do I fix this?
No need to worry, I wrote up a ticket. You'll get a notification from your authenticator app, so please pass me them digits.
1 sec.
Okay.
Yeah. The code is 112345.
Thank you. You fell for the lie, so I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. Cutting it short like a crew cut. Probably think it won't happen to you, but it happened to Uber. They say you win some, you lose some. Boys got a smooth touch hacking you too, bruh. You know how I be creeping and I'm logging in your VPN, and it probably looks anomalous. I'm logged if you be keeping it. I'm probably unaware about the shares that have been peeping, and the reason I'll be seeking them, I'm looking for an easy win. You probably thought it was a magic trick, and you're mad you clicked. I'ma stack my chips and that a DA password is sitting in an admin script. I'm moving quick, I'm on a mission. Yeah, I heard your network is lit. I'm trying to get in. Yeah, I'm trying to get me a hit. When I go fishing. Yeah, you probably think it's legit. I got you clicking. I'm moving quick, I'm on a mission. Yeah, I heard your network is lit. I'm trying to get in. Yeah, I'm trying to get me a hit. When I go fishing. Yeah, you probably think it's legit. I got you clicking.
Hello everyone. Hello and welcome to today's session of the Azure Cloud Security Meetup. So if you're wondering what music you've been listening to, so that is Clicking by our guest speaker today. So I've put a link in the chat window, so make sure you follow him on SoundCloud, for some really interesting music. Okay, so some quick information before we get into the session today. So if you're yet to follow the community meetup page, what are you waiting for? So make sure you go to the page that I'm going to put up in the chat window. So, okay, so Ibrahima can hear me now. So let me get Ibrahima back online. Ibrahima, you're back live now. So let's do this again. Okay. Ibrahima, can you hear me now? And can you say something? Let's make sure we can hear you.
Yes.
Awesome. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Hello, David.
Yeah. Hello. Thanks very much for also joining. So yes, I was just saying before your mic came back online that if people are yet to join, they should make sure that they follow like the community page. So the community meetup group page has been posted in the chat window. So make sure you follow. So yeah, what did you think about the music, Ibrahima? I saw you were enjoying that.
It's dope.
Yeah, it's a really nice one, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and someone I think on Twitter posted the other day said like Leron is probably like one of the best, and I believe that he said the best nerdcore artist that's about these days. That's really interesting music. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to get right into the session. So if you have any questions, make sure you put the questions in the chat window and we'll relay that to Leron as it goes through the topic. So I'll let Leron introduce himself, but one of the way that I sort of like met Leron Ibrahima was like years ago, right? There are very few people that are doing anything relating to like Azure offensive security, Azure pen testing. So, I work for a security company, and we're sort of like looking in that space because I was like in the cloud security group. And I was looking at tools, and that was when I came across a tool called Storm Spotter, right? Which was a tool that could essentially give like the attack graph for an Azure environment, something similar to like what Bloodhound was doing. But that wasn't something that was really out there, apart from, Carl's tool, and I can see Carl in the chat window. Hello, Carl, thanks for joining. Apart from Carl's tool, which was Microboss, there wasn't any other tool that I could see out there. So that was how I got in touch with this guy called Daddy Coco Man, and eventually everything. So let's go ahead and bring Leron up. Hello, Leron, how are you doing?
Hi. I'm doing all right. Thank you.
Yeah. So first of all, where did the Daddy Coco Man name? Where did that come from? Before we let you carry on with your session.
Oh wow. Let's see. So I was in the Navy for a while, and when I first joined the Navy back in like 2008, my last name is Gray. I know it's not on the screen, but my last name is Gray. And there used to be a song called "Chocolate Rain" by Tazon Day. It was like early YouTube videos.
I remember that song. Yep.
And when we were lining up for muster in the Navy, some people used to say like random things, like as opposed to saying like here or whatever or present. And one day I was like chocolate gray, and like it's not random. And I think that caught everybody off guard. And eventually, chocolate gray turned into Daddy Coco Man. I don't remember the specifics, but I think one day I was like, man, I need a new name. I need a handle. And so I gave myself Daddy Coco Man.
That's a very interesting one. Like, I think I'm much more now intrigued in terms of how like Gray turned into Daddy Coco Man, but I think that we'll keep that for for another time. Okay. Yeah. So we'll go to the back studio now, and then we'll hand over to you to carry on with your session. So thanks very much for doing this.
Okay. Thanks for the intro, for sure. And I am going to share this screen as people who give PowerPoints do. Great. So you should see that. Great. Fantastic. Okay. So I recently gave a shorter version of this talk just last week, but I'm going to give a longer version, and we have time for questions, and it's a little bit longer, and we're going to go into a little more detail about some of the items that are later in the slides. But basically, this talk is about how to find tokens in possibly unique ways. There's a lot of we'll get there. I don't want to jump ahead. So who am I? As soon as I can click on the thing, I'll tell you. So yeah, I'm Leron Gray. I'm a senior security consultant at Bishop Fox. I'm from New York, and all New Yorkers got to tell you we're from New York. That's how it works. I've been in offensive security for roughly 9 years. Previously, I was on the Azure Red Team at Microsoft. I was a web app pen tester at another place, and I did things at the National Security Agency for a little while. And none of this is actually really redacted. If you go look at my LinkedIn, there's information there if you're actually curious about some of the stuff that I did within reason. I'm also a PhD candidate at Dakota State University. Hopefully I'll finish fall 2024, if not spring 2025 at the latest. And as you heard from the beginning of this session, I'm also a nerdcore rapper who plays a lot of shows. I'll be at South by Southwest this month, and DEF CON hopefully later this year. All right, so here's the agenda. We're going to talk about some traditional credentials, like the things that you would find on an on-premises network. And then we'll move on to Azure Active Directory credentials, attacking Azure AD only environments, meaning no hybrid environments, just maybe like a small business where everyone has AD, but maybe no actual resources. And then we'll go through a little scenario, and then we'll finish up with a conclusion and some questions and answers. But you are more than welcome to ask questions throughout the talk, and that's fine. Okay, so traditional credentials. So for this, we mean anything that is, in the use of the word traditional here just means anything that's under Active Directory. On premises is probably That'd be another word to say it, right? So Active Directory domain has users, it has machines, it has service accounts, right? Um, it's sort of pretty cut and dry for the most part how a lot of this works. And that is you start from one place, you find credentials, or you laterally move throughout the network using some sort of techniques against the domain. Usually the end goal in a pen test or red team usually is domain admin or something equivalent to it, excuse me, so that you can take over the domain and dump the hashes, right? That's the traditional goal. And the initial access works in several ways, right? You have things like phishing, right? So sending emails and documents, stuff like that. Supply chain attacks, things like SolarWinds was a supply chain attack, or maybe poisoning, different repos to get access. Recently, right, LastPass sort of revealed that they were breached by a user's Plex server at home, right? So that person had a Plex server at home, and then they were able to pivot into the corporate network, right? That sort of falls under exploiting services and applications. The rumor is that Plex also got breached roughly around the same time LastPass did, so maybe who knows? But that could be a supply chain attack if that were true, allegedly, right? And then you have things like the physical and hot plug attacks, which is like dropping USBs in the environment, or like in a parking lot or something like that, or just walking into the computer and plugging something in. For your post-exploitation on Windows, you have sort of generally the same idea, whether it's client or server versions, but you're looking for passwords and documents that are on disk. You look through the Windows Credential Manager for things that are protected by DPOPI, right, or DPAPI, which is protection from that user context. Or you might look for application credentials, right, password managers, FTP, putty keys, things that might be in the registry. For the server versions, it's the same, right, as the client, but you typically focus on the credentials for the purpose of the machine. So if it's a web server, it's IIS credentials. You might look in the web.config. If it's SQL Server, you might look for those database connection strings, etc. And typically those servers on those networks are set up by users with privileged accounts, right? So a lot of times a domain admin might log into a server and set something up, and then, well, now there's traces of that domain admin credential somewhere on that server. Likely, it happens a lot, right? And of course, everybody loves LSAS. That's the keys to the kingdom. You get local admin access, you run Mimikatz, and now you have LSAS, which contains all of these user credentials, hashes, Kerberos tickets, et cetera, et cetera. Right? None of this is new information. This is all the type of stuff that you would traditionally do on an on-premises engagement. And then you also have these network-based attacks, right? Things like pass the hash or using responder to capture hashes and sort of crack those offline. You can do sniffing for plain text credentials. And you have attacks against the domain, which are things like Kerberoasting or Active Directory certificate services templates, which is like the new hotness the last year or so. And then there's been other user or local admin to domain attacks in the last couple of years, mostly involving printers. So it was a lot of printer talk, I think, in 2021. But yeah, there's all sorts of attacks that you can do because your domain is logically connected, right? Everything's on a network for the most part, in a traditional sense, and you're able to access other resources on the network. And so that sort of makes these attacks possible. But when we look at LSAS, it is a primary credential focus. You look for those credentials in LSAS to help you laterally move or potentially gain privilege escalation within the domain. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. But getting local admin in the first place on a target that is locked down could be a lot more difficult, right? So if they have proper least privilege in play in practice, right, on their machines, getting local admin can actually be a little tougher sometimes. And that's when you start looking at domain level attacks rather than maybe you don't need privilege escalation on a single host, but there are other avenues of attack. But when you're looking at an Azure AD environment that doesn't have a domain, right, you start to question, right, is getting access to LSAS as critical, but for maneuvering, right, in the traditional sort of trying to make it like a synonymized with the traditional movement of the movement of the lateral movement of a traditional network. Words are hard today. And so like is getting access to LSAS as critical? Typically, no. But although you do have things like the primary refresh token for persistence, LSAS isn't going to contain as much on an Azure AD endpoint for a regular user as it might for a user that is on a domain. That's just by the nature of the environments being very different. So what type of credentials are we looking for in Azure AD? So Azure AD is, and for those not aware, and this is the Azure Security Meetup, so we have a little more knowledge here. But it is an identity service, right? And it acts as Active Directory in a cloud, in layman's terms, right? They can talk to each other, but they're not interchangeable. It can hold users, service accounts, which are known as service principals, groups, manage identities, devices, and these objects can be given roles over other identities in the AD tenant. And we have this concept of global admin, which is synonymized with Azure AD domain admin. So that's typically the goal, right, for an attacker who's going after Azure. How can they get to global admin or something equivalent that gives them a lot of power over the tenant? So for this talk, though, we're going to assume that we're talking only about pure AD environment. So no Azure AD Connect sync. There's not going to be any Active Directory in Azure in their machines. We're just going to assume that they have some Office 365 licenses and maybe some resources, little to no resources, right? They may not even they might even have a subscription. Maybe they're just using Azure AD by itself. So, so this is how OAuth works. We're going to go through the authentication process. You, as a user, you open your browser and you go to a web page, right? So we'll say Azure Security Meetup.azurewebsites.net, for example. And you get redirected to Azure AD because it wants to make sure that you are allowed to authenticate to this application. You're supposed to be there. So you get redirected. You enter your credentials, which is typically your username and password, and your MFA, because you should have MFA enabled. And Azure AD returns these tokens to you, called an access token and a refresh token. These tokens, the access tokens, are used to, you pass it back to the web app, and it validates it and says, yes, this is the user who says, this is the user that proves their identity for the most part. And then you get redirected back to the page. And that's just the general OAuth process. This is how it works specifically for AAD. Right? There are the primary refresh tokens as well, which are used for single sign-on and registered devices. So this proves that your device is authenticated to Azure AD. Typically, those TPM keys are backed up, the private keys are backed up in TPM. They last 14 days. They get renewed roughly every 4 hours. And those tokens, the primary refresh token, is used to request access tokens and refresh tokens for applications that are SSO enabled, such as Office applications or browsers. And they're saved to this depoppy encrypted cache called the token broker cache that's on disk. All these requests happen over COM objects, and there's a lot of research about this already. And I'm sure I believe both of them have already been on this meetup. I don't want to say that for sure, but I'm pretty sure they have. But if you're interested in those sort of attacks about getting the primary refresh token, I'd highly recommend that you look up Darion and Dr. Azure AD on Twitter, because they have a lot of good research on that. So what do we care about, right, as an attacker? Well, I want your username and password for sure. You can find usernames and passwords in places. You can brute force them. You can password spray. But if the user has MFA, well, then you have to take an extra step of trying to get that MFA code or get them to click approve, right? Depending on the type of MFA that they have enabled for Azure AD. You sort of have to. It's a little bit of a pain, right? To but it's easy sometimes to do, right? Just start spamming, start logging in with their username and password, and then eventually they'll probably click approve. It happens. This is a real technique that works. But more importantly, things like access tokens and refresh tokens are post MFA, right? So we want those because access tokens are short-lived. They're only about an hour. But if you can grab yourself an access token, or if you have the ability to constantly retrieve an access token, even if you don't have the refresh token, that's a good place to be. If you have the refresh token, that's even better because that means you can request access tokens yourself, and you can do it from anywhere for the most part, assuming they don't have things like continuous evaluation of conditional access, continuous evaluation or something, whatever the new product is called. But assuming like none of that is there, the refresh tokens can be used to get access tokens for whatever resource the refresh token is for. Great. And then you have the primary refresh tokens again, but those are the hardest to obtain because you have to go through Mimikatz and all that stuff. In a pure Azure AD environment, a lot of times that is the most difficult thing to get. So let's talk about how we attack all of them. And we have to consider the situation that we're in, right? On a traditional Active Directory environment, you have devices that are logically connected on a network, right? They may be part of the same subnet. But in AD tenant, the devices don't necessarily need to be logically connected. I can have my machine at home that is connected to AD, and you can have your machine at your home connected to AD, and they don't really have the ability to talk to each other logically. In Active Directory, there are attacks against the domain that's possible. In AD, it's less likely to occur. And of course, we're talking about an environment that's only pure AD, in which case attacking Azure AD is even less so. In a hybrid environment, you have things like the AD Connect Sync service, right, which you can target if you are interested in attacking Azure AD from an on-premises perspective. In AD, we have users that are connecting to the domain. They're considered device owners, but they not be the primary users, meaning that anybody can join a machine to a domain, but they may not be the only users. For example, jump boxes are very popular, right? And so the owner of the machine or the person who joined the machine to the domain may not be the one who was constantly using it. In AD, you are a device owner. You may not be the primary user, but you most likely are, right? If you join your machine to AD, the chances are of someone sharing a device with you in AD tenant are a lot slimmer. But I mean, people do all sorts of weird configurations, so you never know. But it's probably very not likely. And then an Active Directory, you have things like group policy or lack of permissions that might help restrict lateral movement. I've been in an environment before where they didn't allow SMB authentication because their domain was actually like in they had Active Directory, but their domain was like in AWS or something. It was something so weird, and they didn't allow SMB between the machines. I was like, okay, sure. I don't know how you got away with that, but if it works, right? It prevented me from actually authenticating to most machines over SMB. And then in Azure AD, you have things like conditional access or Intune, which may restrict where you can authenticate from, right? So a lot of companies will say that, well, you can't authenticate unless you're on an AD joined machine or you're coming from our corporate network, which is fair and probably the right thing to do. But these are sort of considerations that we have to take between coming from Active Directory to Azure AD. So I got a question the other day, and it was like, can you pass a hash in Azure? And the answer is no. Right? In a traditional environment, you have all of these attacks that work. Pass the hash, pass the ticket, Kerberoasting, Active Directory, certificate services templates, credential relaying, all these things, right? Because these are a logical network and you have access to the resources that you're targeting, right? In Azure AD, you probably don't have that. You can do things like pass the ticket quote, and of course that's sort of separate. It was given the name, I think, Azure Silver Ticket a couple of years ago, like back in 2017, where in an SSO environment, and this is only in a hybrid environment, sort of, for the most part. In an SSO environment, you grab the hash for the SSO account in the domain, and then you can start forging tickets for users against the Azure Kerberos instance, right? But it's not really the same, and you can't do that in an Azure AD only environment. That's why it's sort of just like highlighted as a note that yes, is in a hybrid environment you can do it. In a pure Azure AD environment, you most likely cannot. At least not that I know of. And then things like host services, you can't really RDP between machines in the traditional sense. But if a user is RDP to another machine, sure, you can take that over, right? If you happen to have access to their machine. For SMB file shares, if Azure Files is in use, right, you can enumerate those shares the same way that you could a traditional share. And of course, in either case, there's always browser cookies, and browser cookies becomes a lot more important in Azure AD environments because a lot of the activity happens in a browser, such as access to Office, for example, usually occurs in a browser when viewing things like SharePoint. So how do we attack those environments? All right, so we're going to just go through some steps that you would normally take if you were attacking an Azure AD only environment. First, I need to find out who the users are. You can do things like look at LinkedIn or Google for a domain name, right, and look for users. But one of the best ways to do it is to ask a Microsoft service if the user exists. And this is sort of like its own research. There are plenty of tools out there that do this, and they use different types of authentication mechanisms to determine whether or not a user actually exists in the tenant, right? Things like login.microsoftonline.com. If I go there and I type in a username, it may or may not tell me if that user exists, right? Depending on whatever the response, the HTTP response is. I can try logging in as that user. There are things like the SSO endpoint and using the auto logon feature. But two of my favorites are OneDrive and team searching. So OneDrive, if you open up your OneDrive, just you as a user, you get this URL that points to your OneDrive. If it exists, you'll get a 200 if you are that person who is allowed to authenticate to that OneDrive. You'll get a 401 or 403 if you are not authorized to view that OneDrive link, but it still exists. Or you'll get a 404 if it doesn't exist. So if I'm enumerating externally, if I get a 401 or 403, those are the HTTP requested responses that tell me that this username that I'm enumerating is valid. It can be very difficult not very difficult. It can be time consuming. So this is something that you want to automate, right? A couple of Python scripts here and there will get you far. The same thing for team searching, right? If an organization allows the users to send messages, you can actually enumerate users via the Team Search API. So you just open up Teams from an external account, just a random free account, whatever you want, Gmail or Outlook, whatever. And you start typing in the names of users at that domain. And then if it pops up in the search bar, that means that they've allowed users to accept messages in Teams from an external organizations. And these are perfect for phishing, right? The team search is, right? That probably should have been a sub bullet of that. But the team search thing is great for phishing. So let's talk about initial access. There's the traditional initial access, phishing via Outlook, or just email in general. You send your payload through an email, usually has a document or some malicious macro, although macros have been less common, and generally if you send a docm file externally, it will be blocked. So it's probably not something that you want. So people are getting all sorts of creative these days, right? Using ISO files were popular for a while. Zip files were popular, and now it's sending malicious OneNotes. And these are all documents that are allowed by Microsoft to get through, right? Because they're Microsoft applications. But you still have to sort of put in the work to make the phishing look real. In my opinion, I don't know if I should say this, but malicious OneNotes is such a wild concept to me because OneNotes are just clunky in their nature, and it's like having malicious OneNote is seems like it involves a lot of pretext, but apparently not. I would have thought so. It would have required a little more work than just clicking on a file. It seems that a lot of organizations are getting their clicks in these malicious OneNotes. But yeah, we'll move on. So phishing via Teams. Again, if the organization allows the default external messaging from an external organization, then you can send messages or files through Teams. There's different types of payloads you can send. You can send a link to a malicious website asking for the username and password and do some MFA phishing. You can link to malicious Azure AD applications. You can send an Office document with macros, but again, that's still sort of limited. Or you can send a link to a malicious executable. And of course, lateral movement in Azure AD usually involves, and lateral movement is kind of a loose term here, but refresh and access tokens, primary refresh tokens, if you can get those, storage keys, database connection strings, anything that connects to an Azure resource can be considered a lateral movement path, right? Particularly if it came from a completely different resource. And then things like malicious Azure AD applications, which are easier to do if you already have access internally, if your permissions allows you to create an application as an internal user. So we have this scenario here. We have this company called Wacky Vacuums with this random tenant ID, which is like my dev tenant. They're an Azure AD only company. They don't have any resources in Azure. They have an Office license, M365 license, right? So they use Word, PowerPoint, Teams, SharePoint, etc. The users on their device, the devices themselves are Intune managed, and the users do not have local admin on their company laptops, meaning you can't run Mimikatz to get their primary refresh token easily, right? You would have to find a way to escalate on that local machine, which is a pain sometimes. And users have a variety of AD roles depending on their job. So in this particular scenario, one second. Excuse me. In this particular scenario, we found on LinkedIn that it said one user runs the help desk, and their name is Megan Bowen. So how do we enumerate Megan Bowen, or just users in general? We want to be able to fish the help desk admin, and so that's sort of the goal here. But I'm sorry, let me rephrase it. This is the wrong title for the slide. We're going to enumerate the users. We're going to fish the help desk admin, and we're going to exfil some access tokens. We don't need a full C2 to do this. Like there would be no reason for me to drop Sliver or Covenant or anything like that in order just to get an access token. That's a little too heavy, and it's probably more likely to get you caught if you try to do that. Why are we aiming for them? Well, if they're the help desk, then they can probably reset passwords for users. And there is a chart, which I think originally came from SpectreOps, and that was put into the Microsoft documentation about who can reset passwords. So it's definitely something that it's sort of a tiered password reset list. And help desk administrators can reset passwords for, I believe, each other and normal users. They can't reset passwords for global administrators or anything like that. But this is a good method for lateral movement, right? If I want to get to somewhere else, right, why not just reset their password as an attacker? In a normal engagement, you probably can't do this without permission. And so I'll put that caveat on this. But an attacker might actually do this, right? Reset a password and lock somebody out. And we don't need to get the primary refresh token because that's definitely not what we need. We just need the ability to get access as the help desk admin, right? So let's start with Teams enumeration. Why? Because we can confirm if the user account exists, and we can determine if Teams is a possible phishing vector. So how do we determine the username format? You can look for emails in like LinkedIn and data breaches and see if you can find the format there. You can actually Google the company name email format, and there's a website, I forget what it's called at the moment, but it says like 99% of users at this company have this email format. It'll be like first name or last name or something like that. In this case, it won't work because this is the developer tenant with a whole bunch of fake data, so we can't really look for it. But this is a good search to look up if you're trying to find the format of an email address. And then we can sort of guess just from the name. We can try first initial, last name, or first name, dot last name, or first name, last initial. We can try all these different combinations just to see what pops up, right? And then once we get one, we can sort of determine what the other ones might be. I've come across situations where some clients have had unique names for their users, and they weren't really representative of like the actual username. They just be like some random string of letters, which makes it a lot more difficult to enumerate these things. But ultimately, everybody has an email address, so even if there's like a different way of handling it, you'll eventually find it if you just look hard enough and search Google hard enough. So in this little video, I open up Teams. Let me hit play there. So I open up Teams, and I'm connected with my personal email address, daddycokeman@gmail.com. And I am searching for M. Bowen at the tenant name. And so I'm just sort of guessing what their username format might be, because, and I'm sorry if it looks a little small on the screen, but what I expect is something to show up. So M. Bowen didn't work. Now I tried Megan.Bowen, and that didn't work either. Nothing popped up. Then I tried Megan B, and then you'll see that Megan Brown's name, Bowen's name popped up with the name of their tenant. In this case, it says Microsoft because it's, again, the developer's sample pack. But it would normally have the actual tenant name there. And the fact that I can open up a message with them tells me that I can actually send them a chat. So Teams enumeration is very useful. There is a way to sort of automate this. I have my own tool that I use for this. And basically, I'll see if I can get it released one day. I'll talk to the company, right? But basically what I do here, and this is sort of the original version of this and not the current version. I take a list of names, and this names comes from the sec list that you would find on GitHub. And I sort of slice them up into, so actually, let me grab a pen real quick. Sort of explain what's happening here. So I open up this file, names.txt, and I read all the files and get all the names. And then we sort of, knowing that the format is first name, last initial, we take all of the first names and then we create like combinations with every single ASCII letter, A through Z, right? We just need lowercase because these searches aren't case sensitive. And so, for example, you would have Megan A, Megan B, Megan C, Megan D, right? For every one of these names. And we sort of just append the domain onto it. We can request up to 5 at a time. If you try to request more than 5, it'll actually yell at you. And I think you get like a 4 or something. I don't remember what it was. But you can't do more than 5 at a time. And then we start enumerating those users. So we pass it a list. That is not correct. we look at the Teams URL for searching users, which is here. Right? Let me do that the right way. And we pass the users in this JSON format. And what gets returned are all of the users that are valid. So if I search up to 5, we can get, if all 5 users are valid, we'll get all 5 back. And we sort of, after this, it's not shown here, I save this to a CSV file. And here's an example, right? So using that same, that idea, I can enumerate all these usernames, right? For this tenant. And it goes in a little spreadsheet and looks a little nice. And now I have usernames to maybe password spray against later. There's something that you should know about this is that you should stay in scope if you're doing an engagement. Sometimes the user principal name and the email fields don't match. And so you have to go by the user principal name because that is what is recognized by the object in Azure AD. But sometimes, depending on how maybe the organization was before they joined, Azure or just some other considerations, the email address might be different. So you want to make sure that everything that you're touching is in scope. And if you have any questions, you should probably ask your point of contact if it is okay to target certain users who have email domains outside of their tenant domains. So we want to fish the help desk admin. And there's a bunch of different ways we can do this. Oh, again, we can use a malicious Azure AD application. This may get blocked by policies, but you do get the ability to act on behalf of the user. So you can request as many permissions as you want, realistically, and you would get those permissions for that user. There's also the Office document, and this is what we're actually going to use here, because in the next slide, I did something really cool that I like to show off. And again, I mentioned earlier that Office documents, if you try to send them through Outlook, they'll get blocked. But you can send them through Teams, no problem. That doesn't really have any effect. You can send something through Teams, but there is something, a consideration there that we'll talk about in a second too. And of course, you can send an executable, but again, you don't necessarily need to send executables because that looks weird sending an exe over Teams. But a document over Teams is pretty natural for the environment, right? So let's talk about this Office macro that I wrote. So I wrote this macro to start when the document opens, and that's defined by this document open thing. This is my first time writing something in Visual Basic, so bear with me. It took me like all night, like a day and a half to get this working properly. And then we have all these structures where we'll skip those, but we just need to define some variables and stuff like that. But what we're doing is that we're looking for this regex object, which is EYJ0EX. And what this is the beginning of a JSON web token, right? So this is what the access token format looks like. And this is what I care about. I want to get this person's access token. I'm looking for this pattern. And then what I'm doing is I'm scanning the region of memory for the Word, because this is opening in Word. I'm scanning Word's own memory looking for this. So if you didn't know, and there's been a lot of talk about this, I guess, in the last couple months, roughly. And as I mentioned before, applications that authenticate to Azure AD, such as Office, right, need those access tokens in order to interact with Graph, right, Microsoft Graph and stuff like that. So these access tokens are going to be in memory somewhere. Normally, what people do are they'll take a memory dump of Word, and then they'll just search for this and extract it, and which also works, right? That's not a problem. But what I'm doing here is that I'm taking this access token regex, and then I'm just scanning Word's own memory. So I'm not touching another process. I don't need to drop any executables on file. I don't need to do anything like that. It's just a process is reading its own memory, and that's not very suspicious. The macro itself is suspicious, right? If something that analyzed the macro saw this, it should flag. But the action of reading of Word reading its own memory is not suspicious whatsoever. So we're going to limit this to 100 because I've just found out that if you do like too many, Visual Basic doesn't like that for whatever reason. If we limit it to 100 results, it's probably way more than we need. And then we exfil the tokens. In this case, I assumed that the user also had Outlook installed, and this may not be the best way to do it. You don't have to do it, right? So I'm really bad at drawing straight lines, so excuse me. We create this object here. I just turn this into a circle. We create this object, the Outlook application. We're using the COM interface to open up Outlook, and then we're going to send this to my attacker email. And my attacker email in this case was a Teams channel that I made, because you can assign email addresses to Teams channels, and so it's just like a notification for me. Hey, I got a new email, right? It's sort of Teams as a C2, if you want to call it that, but not really. It's just a way for me to dump the information, but it could be any normal email address, right? And then I just send all the tokens back that were retrieved from memory. So again, you can use any exfil method that you want. An HTTP request works, or any other sort of exfil. But chances are, if this is an Azure AD only environment, they're probably using Outlook on their desktop. So This is a safe bet for the most part. There are some alternative macro ideas, and again, we're doing this over Teams, and so we don't have to worry about Word. We don't have to worry about Outlook blocking at all, really. But you can replace the user's macro template with a malicious macro, so that you can get access tokens every time they open Word, right? For example, so if I were to replace that macro and put that in their normal .m file, every time that they open up Word, I would get their access tokens, and that's a method of persistence, an interesting one, really. And then alternatively, you can just get the token broker cache files and decrypt them, which we talk about. That's where the tokens are stored by applications that use like SSO and even Word and stuff like that. They are depoppy encrypted, so you have to decrypt that in the macro. But this is probably best if you're just gonna smash and grab and just like leave and never come back. Because the more you do this, the more likely it is probably to get detected, I would imagine. But I mean, it still works, right? If it works for the moment when you need it, it works. Also, actually, we'll get there. So, phishing the help desk user, right? So here's my attacker view. I'm saying, "Hi, Megan," and what Megan sees is this: Leron Gray external wants to chat with you. There's no indication of an email on there anywhere. It's just, I want to chat with you. So if I had found out who Megan worked for and maybe like used like that name instead, right? It sort of looks more realistic as, yeah, here's this user. Oh, that's, manager wants to chat with you. Hey, I can't log in right now, but can you XYZ open this file for me kind of deal, right? There's all sorts of pretexts you can do with that. Once they've accepted the message, it says external at the top, and this is what they see, just like a normal Teams message. And it's also over here as well. So let's go through this step. We are going to try to phish this user. And we'll see what happens. So I sent a message saying, "Hey, I got an error about my token data," whatever that means. Can you check this out? Sure. Megan gives the thumbs up at 1:28 a.m. because she's a dedicated employee. And she opens up this document file. Now, what happened here, right? So there's a malicious macro in this document, but it opened up in the browser, because by default, if you open up something in Teams, it will open in the browser rather than on the desktop. She didn't click download or anything like that. So the question is, how do we get users to download stuff? It can be very difficult sometimes. If you're phishing internally, like for example, if you're trying to go from one user to another, you can actually use something like information rights management. That's actually a way for you to say, "Hey, this document is protected and only should be seen by certain users, and this is not allowed to open up in a browser. You can only open up IRM documents on a desktop." So if you want to force somebody to open up on a desktop and it has a malicious macro in it, IRM is the way to go. Same thing for, I guess, Azure Information Protection. Same difference, and that way you can track who's opening it. But but that isn't going to work here. Externally, we're just going to send a link to a storage account and have the user download the document. It looks suspicious, but if you name your files correctly, your domains correctly, it maybe doesn't look as suspicious. In this case, I didn't have a custom domain to use, but you'll see that it says WV1T3 files, and Megan goes and downloads this at 3:06 a.m. They open the file, and then something interesting happens here. So the file is opening. They're going to enable editing, and then I know it just says hello, but we're going to pretend like it enticed them to enable macros. So here, you'll notice that the screen is loading, and what's actually happening is that it's scanning memory for those tokens, right, when that happens. And then on the bottom right in this system tray, you'll see that there's an Outlook symbol. And that is the sign that Outlook is sending an email. So at most, if they're paying attention, That's what they'll see. I actually didn't see this until several times after me performing this and testing this macro out. So I missed it. I'm sure a random other user will miss it. But that's all the indication is. Another program is using Outlook. That's it. It's overcom. There's no indication about what it is. It's just I chose the Outlook exfil method, and this is what popped up. And so if I look at where am I? If I look at my email, we get a bunch of tokens back. These tokens have things for like Outlook, Office 365, Substrate, API, and stuff like that. Now, granted, we didn't get the help desk tokens that we wanted, but again, we talked about the token broker cache, so it's also possible like to do it that way. I just didn't have time to figure out. Excuse me, 1 second. I didn't have time to figure out that macro because it's Visual Basic, and I do not like writing in Visual Basic. So, but at a minimum, right? We can now read Megan's email. We can send email as Megan, and again, it's more the method here that matters than the luck of the results. But of course, Word is going to need access to Outlook. It's going to need access to Substrate, and of course, Office.net. So here's how we can get some tokens just from a nice little macro without having to spawn any additional processes, without having to touch files on disk. This is just give me your tokens out of memory, the same way that people have been doing with memory dumps directly. All right, so we'll conclude the talk. The takeaway points here are that approaching Azure AD environments is very different than Active Directory or even a hybrid AD environment where you might have things like AD Connect Sync. If you're looking for user identity credentials, right, access and refresh tokens are the way to go if you can get your hands on those. Initial access and lateral movement require different thinking because you don't have the traditional logical domain. You have to sort of understand how the Azure AD devices are connected and the situation that they're in as far as like conditional access or stuff like that. And then social engineering is very important if you are a client or even just a malicious person, right? Sometimes I get engagements where we get like a pure hybrid, a pure AD environment, and they're like, no social engineering. And I'm kind of like, well, okay, like here's access to this machine. Where am I supposed to go from here? Maybe look through SharePoint for credentials, stuff like that. But if you want like a true experience of attacking Azure AD, you definitely want to make sure that things like social engineering are key because these are real attack vectors that are commonly used in a cloud environment. It can't be approached the same way like you're using like an on-premises engagement that doesn't require social engineering. It's not the same, and you're going to get less impact and in your engagement if you don't allow or aren't allowed social engineering. And you have to be creative. Again, right? That macro took me. I just had the idea like to do it. I was like, I wonder if this is going to work, and sure enough, it worked. So sometimes you just have to be creative because new things don't get caught right away. That's the best way to put it. As long as you're not doing anything suspicious, a new thing won't get caught right away until someone writes a detection for it. So I am up for questions and answers.
Awesome. That's very awesome. That's awesome. Thanks very much for that, Leron. A lot of things that you shared there, a lot of information, and I strongly recommend that people go through like the videos again. There's a lot of things that Leron mentioned that's really really interesting to look into and try to understand. So there's a lot of like risks here, I guess, with the growing ecosystem of just the applications that we have interacting more and more and using Azure AD for authentication, and then to be able to get tokens to be able to access some of these applications that potentially could even contain really, really sensitive information for the organization. So from a defense perspective, I guess, like what would be like the most important thing that you recommend like to people, so like make sure that you have, MFA, like even for performing certain sensitive actions, or like what would you recommend from a defense perspective?
So of course MFA. And I guess there's certain there's certain things that I've seen recently in environments that are not like only Azure AD, but of course MFA is important. You definitely want that. The location-based MFA is probably the best one. The one that doesn't just say deny or approve. It's the one that shows the map of where you're at and gives you the number that you have to input. That is probably the best form that is available right now.
Yeah.
So yes, that. Conditional access is also very important. Making sure that users can only connect from AD approved machine or Intune joined machines, or from the corporate network if they happen to have one. If they don't have a corporate network, then you must have Intune. Like that's sort of a must. So don't allow people to join random devices into your tenant, right? From a security perspective. If you have like mobile devices and stuff like that, particularly on Android, use things like the work profile, right? Which is great for not only keeping the user's data separate if they can't get like a separate phone for whatever reason, but that's something that's like highly recommended. Ensuring that users can't, arbitrary users can't add applications to the tenant or create their own applications. That's a common vector, right? It's easy to phish people and get tokens, but once you're inside, you still have to make sure that your controls are good. So take some of the common cloud attack vectors and make sure they can't do that. Things like password-based authentication, everything should be in key vaults, or even certificate-based authentication. Everything should be in key vaults. You shouldn't have any applications. Even you shouldn't have like how like Azure Functions has like the settings, the application settings and stuff like that. You shouldn't even keep secrets in there. You should keep the link to a key vault URL in those secrets instead, right? That way the application still has to reach out to key vault where the secret is, and some random user can't just dump the secrets out of the settings just because they can see it, right? There's all these sorts of different tiered approaches to protecting different resources and different and identities that it can be complex.
Yeah, that's true. And I'll let you ask is there any question I asked in mind, but I've got to ask this for the people and also for myself, like in the background. Are we going to get like a release of the tool at some point? I
would love to. I have no problem releasing it. I just have to talk to some people.
Yeah. So you had it. Yeah. So make sure that you follow. Make sure you follow Leron's GitHub page. I'll put it in the chat window again. So make sure you follow. So whenever the tool for enumerating users, automating the enumeration of users in Teams, whenever that tool is released, you'll be able to find it there. There's a question that's in the chat window. I'm not sure if Ibrahim, do you want to take that? I think there's a question in the chat window. Let's see that. Oh, okay.
Let me see.
Will the slides be shared? I can probably share this. I need to ask somebody first. I can probably share these.
Yeah, and just to mention also, the folk to ask and to mention. So this is also recorded on YouTube, so you can always go back to like watch that, and you can always go back to check, the amazing information that Leron has passed to us. There's a lot of stuff to like break down in terms of what Leron has said, but I think we've run out of time now. So what I'll also do is again. So Jason asked a question and said, are you planning to do more presentations like this in the future?
I think that was the
yeah, go ahead, Ibrahim. Sorry.
That was the only question.
Yes. Yeah.
I said I think that was just one question.
Yes.
And I guess it's clear for everyone. So now we all know how to find tokens.
Yeah. True. True. So Gershon asked another one. I think another one came in now, which is, will you be doing more presentations in the future?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm currently in my PhD process, and there's so many things that I want to talk about, like the work that I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
But that is my primary focus for like this year and my next year's like personal research. As far as presentations on Azure, I don't do as much. Like the chances that people like Darion or Carl or Dr. Azure AD will get to something before I do is very high. And so yes, I can do more presentations, but you're likely going to hear something from them before you hear something from me. Now that I no longer work at Microsoft, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can do talks all the time. Anytime.
Awesome. Thanks very much for that. So thanks very much everyone for joining us. Again, one of the ways to sort of like stay in touch. So we have, Leron mentioned Carl. So Carl will also be joining us later in this series where we're going to be going through, some recent information based on some research that he did also. So thanks very much, Leron, for doing this. Lots of information. I'll definitely be watching the video, and I'll definitely be making my notes, and I'll probably reach out to you with 1 or 2 questions as I go through like the video. If any final words from you, Leron, before we call it a day today?
No, just thanks for having me. This is fun. We finally got to do this after like a year and a half.
Finally.
Thanks again, Leron. Insightful session.
Yeah,
And do you plan Samsung?
I was invited to go to CCC camp in Germany this year. I would like to put out some more music before. Yes.
Awesome. I'll be looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, everyone. See you. Have a lovely rest of the day. Bye, everyone.